Okay, people also asked about the late 1800s and the early 1900s. We already talked about the Spanish-American War. That kicks off an era of American empire. We mentioned those banana wars, those U.S. interventions fought in Latin America. And that American empire period really culminates in World War I. But the late 1800s are also characterized by some reform movements. First, some agrarian-based reform movements, some farmer-led reform movements, starting with the Grangers, evolving into the Farmers Alliance, an interest group, and then culminating in the Populist Party that we've studied. And remember, the Populist Party is going to have a lasting impact, even though it's effectively dead and over after 1896. The idea of a graduated income tax, the idea of universally accessible crop loans for farmers, the idea of a secret Australian ballot, and the idea of direct election of senators, all of these things will become part of the United States. And really, many of these ideas are picked up and ran with by the progressive movement. This is that movement in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, to address the concerns brought on by the rapid urbanization, by the rapid industrialization of the late 1800s, and what the progressives do. That's different than those reform movements from, say, the early 1800s, those reform movements that grew out of the Second Great Awakening. Those reform movements were about changing the person and making a connection with people and getting them to do better. The progressive movement is all about getting government to help. Before the progressive movement, you could make the case that the federal government delivered the mail and protected our nation's borders, but that was about it. The progressive movement is going to make the federal, state, and local governments much more responsive to the needs of the people, with things like trust busting and laws to protect consumers like the Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Act, laws to protect the environment like the expansion of the National Park System and the U.S. Forest Service, and laws to reform the banking system with the creation of the Federal Reserve. Even taxes are made more equitable under the progressive movement with the lowering of the tariff and the implementation of a graduated income tax with the 16th Amendment. The progressive movement comes to an end, we could say, in 1920 with Warren G. Harding's election on a policy of the return to normalcy. Really marks an end to the reform of the late 1800s and early 1900s.